July 1944. The United States held approximately 70% of all the gold in the world. World War II was still being fought. Europe was in ruins. 22 countries were still under Axis occupation. 44 nations sent delegations to a mountain hotel in New Hampshire to answer one question: what should back the world's money after the war? The answer was obvious: gold. America had most of it. A gold system would be credible, finite, impossible to manipulate. They didn't build a gold system. They built a dollar system. If you were alive on August 15, 1971, you watched half of that system collapse on television. Nixon came on screen and told you the dollar was no longer backed by gold. What he did not tell you, what almost nobody reported, was that the more important half of the system was still running. It is still running today, and it is the reason the savings you built over 40 years are worth what they are, and the reason they are under a pressure most financial advisors are not explaining to you. That decision, made in 3 weeks at a resort in the mountains, is the reason the United States government can borrow $2 trillion a year today, in a non-crisis year, without the bond market collapsing. Not despite having the gold, because they chose debt instead. Here is why they chose the dollar system over gold. A gold standard would have constrained American spending. Under gold, you can only spend what you have. No country gets a structural advantage. Every government faces the same discipline. A dollar system was completely different. If the world's reserve currency is your currency, if every country needs to hold your money as the foundation of their financial system, then those countries are permanently, structurally, buying your government debt. Not because they want to, because the architecture requires it. A gold standard is a cage. The U.S. had most of the gold. It chose not to build the cage, and that choice gave America a permanent credit line, extended by every country on Earth, whether they agreed to it or not. The $2 trillion annual deficit you see in the news today? That is the direct consequence of what was decided in that hotel. My name is Marcus. This channel traces the architecture of financial power, the decisions, the mechanisms, and the data that show where it is changing before the headlines cover it. Here is the direct line from that 1944 decision to your money today. The Bretton Woods system created permanent structural demand for U.S. dollars from every country on Earth, not because those countries wanted dollars, because the system gave them no alternative. That forced demand suppresses U.S. borrowing costs. Economists estimate the advantage at 50 to 100 basis points below where they would otherwise clear. On $34 trillion of debt, that is between $170 billion and $340 billion in annual interest savings, every single year, for 80 years, funded by every country that holds dollar reserves, none of whom agreed to fund it. Here is what that means if you are an American. If you hold Treasury bonds in your 401k or IRA, if you hold dollar savings accounts, if you receive or expect to receive Social Security, you are holding instruments that are priced on one assumption, that the U.S. government can borrow cheaply, indefinitely, Social Security, Medicare, federal pension obligations. All of them are funded by an assumption that U.S. borrowing costs stay manageable. All of them depend on the mandatory creditor relationship that Bretton Woods created. When that relationship weakens, and the data shows it is weakening, the question is not abstract global macro. It lands directly on the purchasing power of what you saved. They were the mandatory creditors of the United States, not by treaty, by architecture. And right now, every central bank reserve manager in the world is quietly rerunning the same calculation, with different inputs than they had in 2021. Quick question. If you held 70% of the world's gold in 1944, what would you have built? A gold system that constrained everyone equally, or a dollar system that gave you permanent deficit flexibility? Gold or dollar? Drop your answer now, and one sentence why. I will come back to the best responses. Bretton Woods created the IMF and the World Bank. Most accounts stop there. That framing misses what was actually decided. 3 specific mechanisms were built into the architecture. Each one tilted the global financial system toward American advantage. Together, they created something that has run for 80 years. Mechanism 1. The Gold Alibi. The agreement pegged the US dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency was pegged to the dollar. The dollar was convertible to gold. Every other currency was convertible to dollars. The surface reading, a gold standard. The dollar is just the most convenient unit. The correct reading, a dollar standard dressed as a gold standard. Under a true gold standard, every country holds gold. Every currency is a claim on gold in that country's own vaults. No single country controls the reserve asset. Under Bretton Woods, every country held dollars. Dollars were a claim on American gold. Every country's monetary system ran through Washington. If your country wanted stable money after 1944, you had to hold dollars. Holding dollars meant buying U.S. Treasury bonds. Buying Treasury bonds meant lending to the American government. You didn't choose this. The architecture chose it for you. The gold standard was the alibi. The dollar standard was the architecture. Every country that managed its exchange rate was, by structural necessity, lending to America. In 1944, one man tried to stop all of this from happening. His name was John Maynard Keynes. He lost. And the reason he lost is why the $2 trillion deficit exists today. Keynes arrived in New Hampshire with a different proposal, not a refinement of the dollar system, a completely different architecture. He called it the International Clearing Union, a new global reserve currency, the bancor, that no single country controlled. Countries running persistent surpluses would be penalized. Countries running persistent deficits would also be penalized. No single country could run structural deficits indefinitely at the expense of everyone else. The American delegation rejected it, not because it was technically flawed, because it would have stopped America from doing exactly what it subsequently did. Keynes understood what was happening. In his final speech at the conference, he said, "We are attempting to use what is to be a permanent institution to solve what is a passing problem. The result may be that we find ourselves with a permanent problem." The passing problem was post-war reconstruction. The permanent institution was the dollar reserve system. The permanent problem, which Keynes identified in 1944, is what happens when the world's reserve currency issuer decides to spend without limit. He described the $2 trillion annual deficit of 2024, 80 years before it existed. He lost the argument. White's dollar system was adopted, and the world has been absorbing the consequences ever since. Britain arrived at that conference as the world's second financial power. It left having surrendered everything, not because it lost a war, because it needed a loan. And America wrote the terms. The pound sterling had served as the world's reserve currency for nearly 2 centuries. Australia, India, the Gulf, across the Commonwealth. All of them held sterling as their primary reserve. That was the infrastructure of British financial primacy. And in 1945, America demanded it be dismantled. The price of the post-war loan was specific. Britain had to make sterling freely convertible to dollars. Within 1 year, Britain complied. The result was a run on sterling so severe, convertibility had to be suspended within 6 weeks. The sterling area's credibility was broken. Every country that had held sterling needed an alternative. There was one alternative: dollars. Britain didn't surrender reserve currency status in a financial crisis. It surrendered it in a loan negotiation. America didn't win reserve dominance in battle. It wrote it into the terms. The dismantling of the sterling area was not a side effect of Bretton Woods. It was a precondition for the dollar system achieving global reach. Without it, a significant portion of world trade would have continued in a non-dollar system. That portion was legislated into dollar dependency, by a loan agreement, not by market choice. Structural winner, the United States Treasury, specifically, the ability to run structural deficits funded by mandatory foreign creditors at below-market interest rates for 80 consecutive years. Estimated annual borrowing cost saving, $170 billion to $340 billion every year, automatically. The largest sustained wealth transfer in the history of international economics. The structural loser. Every country that holds dollar reserves, because the architecture gives them no structural alternative. Britain surrendered explicitly and under documented financial duress. Emerging markets entered dollar dependency without any negotiation, simply by being born into a world where the alternative had been written out of existence. Let me give you the number that makes this concrete. Foreign central banks must hold dollar reserves. U.S. Treasury bonds are the primary dollar reserve asset. There is permanent structural price-insensitive demand for American government debt. Price-insensitive means these buyers do not purchase because the yield is attractive. They purchase because the architecture requires it. That demand suppresses U.S. borrowing costs by 50 to 100 basis points. On $34 trillion of debt. That is $170 billion to $340 billion in annual savings. Every single year. For 80 years. Funded by countries that never agreed to fund it. The countries lending to America at below-market rates did not volunteer for that role. They were assigned it by an architecture they had no part in designing. The least discussed loser is the emerging market world. A developing country holding dollar reserves is simultaneously building financial cushion and permanently lending to the United States at subsidized rates. The capital that could have funded domestic roads, hospitals, infrastructure, is sitting in U.S. Treasury bonds, earning the American government a borrowing discount. Without a seat at the 1944 negotiating table. Without a vote on the architecture. Simply by being born into a world where the alternative had already been written out of existence in New Hampshire in July 1944. Now the story gets strange. Because the man who designed this entire system, the man who defeated Keynes, rejected the Bancor, and built the dollar standard, was not working only for America. Harry Dexter White was subsequently confirmed to have been a Soviet intelligence asset. For anyone who grew up during the Cold War, take a moment with this. You grew up being told the Soviet Union was the existential threat to the American way of life. You watched the space race, the arms race, the proxy wars. You may remember the names: Alger Hiss, Julius Rosenberg, the Venona Files. The financial system that funded American military dominance for 80 years, the architecture that made the dollar mandatory for every country on Earth, was designed by a man who was simultaneously sending information to Moscow. The Cold War you lived through was being financed by a system built in part by a Soviet agent. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is in the declassified NSA files. And it has been there since 1995. This was established by the Venona Project, the declassified NSA program that decoded Soviet intelligence communications during the 1940s. Corroborated by KGB archival material. Not disputed by serious historians. The architect of American financial dominance was simultaneously reporting to Moscow. That fact raises a question that has never been fully resolved. Did Soviet intelligence understand, in 1944, that a system with no deficit discipline would eventually produce the overreach that would strain American dominance? Did they prefer the dollar standard to the Bancor, precisely because the Bancor would have been more durable? We do not know. The historical record is incomplete. What we do know, the man who stopped the balanced system from being built, was working for the country that most needed the dominant system to eventually overextend itself. Keynes tried to build a system that would constrain deficits for every country equally. The man who stopped him was later confirmed to be a Soviet agent. Whether that is irony, coincidence, or architecture, you decide. And 80 years later, the world is building what Keynes proposed. Not in a conference room in New Hampshire, in bilateral swap lines, in gold vaults, in SIPS transaction volumes, in M-Bridge pilots, one instrument at a time. Prediction question. The Bancor, Keynes's balanced multi-currency system, was rejected in 1944. The world is now building something remarkably similar. Which crosses the threshold first? CIPS reaching 20% of SWIFT volume, or the first G20 country formally reducing its dollar reserve share below 40%? Drop your most specific prediction. The four instruments. The Bretton Woods architecture will not announce its own erosion. It will appear in 4 specific data series before any headline covers it. Signal 1. Dollar share of global foreign exchange reserves. Threshold. Below 55% in any single quarter. Structural break signal. Current. Approximately 59%. Peak was 71% in 2001. 12 percentage points lost in 20 years, slowly but directionally. A drop below 55% signals active diversification by reserve managers, not maintenance of existing allocations. Source: IMF Currency Composition of Official Foreign Exchange Reserves, COFR, quarterly at imf.org, EN Publications, COFR, Signal. 2. Central Bank Gold Purchases. Threshold: any quarter where EM and Gulf purchases exceed 300 tons, cursed gold has become strategic reallocation, not a hedge. Current: over 1,000 tons annually in both 2022 and 2023, the highest rate since 1967. Every ton of gold is a ton not held in U.S. Treasuries. Gold is the only reserve asset that is nobody's liability. Largest buyers: emerging market central banks and Gulf sovereign wealth funds. Source: World Gold Council Quarterly Gold Demand Trends at gold.org. Signal 3. IMF Voting Share. Threshold: any U.S. voting share below 15%, American veto power disappears. The U.S. currently holds 17% plus, enough to block any decision requiring an 85% supermajority. China has pushed for voting reforms consistently since 2015. Watch reform proposals as the leading indicator. Source: IMF Annual Report at imf.org, Quota and Voting Share Tables. Signal 4. PBOC Bilateral Swap Line. Network versus Fed Swap Line Network. Threshold: PBOC network exceeds Fed network by total volume. Yar's dollar dependency has lost its institutional monopoly. A bilateral swap line lets 2 central banks exchange currencies directly, bypassing dollar intermediation entirely. The PBOC has extended swap lines to over 40 central banks across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Each new line is a country building structural capacity to operate outside the dollar system. Let me bring this back to the paradox we started with. The United States held most of the world's gold in 1944. A gold system was the obvious choice, the safe choice. They chose the dollar system. Now you know exactly why. A gold standard would have constrained American spending equally with everyone else. A dollar system made American spending everyone else's problem. Every country holding dollar reserves today is a creditor of the United States. Not by choice. By the consequences of a debate at a mountain hotel in July 1944. A debate that Keynes lost. That architecture has funded American military dominance and peacetime deficits for 80 years. It has delivered below-market borrowing costs permanently to one country, and charged the cost to every nation that holds dollars. The most elegant part of the Bretton Woods system was that the countries paying for American deficits never had to agree to pay. The architecture collected the payment automatically. That architecture is now under its first serious stress test since 1971. The dollar standard survived the end of gold convertibility. It survived 2008. It has survived because in each case the alternatives were not ready. The mandatory creditors are now building the alternatives, not in a conference room. In data you can track right now. I told you I would come back to the comment question. Gold or dollar? What would you have built in 1944? My structural answer: the gold system would have been more stable for the world. The dollar system was more powerful for the country doing the building. Powerful and stable are not the same thing. The architects of Bretton Woods knew that. They chose powerful. One last thought for anyone who built their savings inside this system. The Bretton Woods architecture was not designed to protect you. It was designed to give the United States government permanent access to cheap financing. For 80 years, those two things happened to align. Cheap government borrowing meant stable dollar purchasing power. Stable purchasing power meant your savings held their value. The question worth asking, the one the 4 signals I gave you will help you answer, is whether those two things will continue to align, or whether the gap between what this system was built to fund and what it is now being asked to fund is finally large enough to matter. The data is public. Now you know where to look. We are living in the 80-year consequences of that 1944 choice, and we are now close enough to the end of those consequences to see them in the data. That is what this channel is for, not the headlines. The architecture underneath the headlines. Welcome to the geopolitics of money.